Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Richard Ryan, and I am Senior Washington Correspondent for the Detroit News and President of the National Press Club. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, and those of you watching on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio. The video archive of today's luncheon is provided by Connect Live and is available through the National Press Club website at press.org. National Press Club luncheons are also carried live by many sites on the World Wide Web. Press Club members may also access transcripts of our luncheons at our website. Non-members may purchase transcripts, audio and videotapes by calling 1-888-343-1940. Before introducing our head table, I would like to remind our members of some upcoming speakers. Tomorrow, on May 3rd, Vladimir Gozinski, Chairman of the Board of MediaMost, parent company of NTV, will speak on freedom of the press and the future of Russia. On Friday, May 4th, Richard Moe, President of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, will be our guest. And on Friday, May 11th, William Gates Sr., co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, will speak at the National Press Club. If you have any questions for our speaker, please write them on the cards that are provided at your table and pass them up to me. But please make sure to write legibly, because I can't ask them if I can't read them. And I will ask as many as time will permit. I'd now like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. And please hold your applause until all head table guests are introduced. From your right and my left, Frank Davies of the Miami Herald. Paul De La Garza of the St. Petersburg Times. Rob Ritchie, Executive Director, Center for Voting and Democracy. Wayne Washington of the Boston Globe. Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins, President of the League of Women Voters of the United States. Rick Dunham, Political Correspondent for Business Week and Chairman of the Board of Governors of the National Press Club. Frank Okafor, Chairman of the National Press Club Speaker Committee and a former president of the National Press Club. And skipping over our speaker for a moment, Darcy McConnell, Detroit News, and a member of the Speakers Committee who arranged today's luncheon. Thank you, Darcy. Julia Hudson, Chief of Staff for D.C. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. Catherine Skiba of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Larry Bivens, Gannett News Service, and a member of the National Press Club Board of Governors. And Will Lester, political writer for the Associated Press. Thank you. Few political operatives in the country have a better perspective on the need for election reform than our guest today, Donna Brazile. Ms. Brazile managed Al Gore's losing presidential campaign last year, the first African-American woman ever to manage a major presidential campaign. As we all know now, Vice President Gore won the nationwide popular vote, but lost the Electoral College vote to George W. Bush, becoming the first presidential candidate since Grover Cleveland lost to Benjamin Harrison in 1888 to achieve that dubious distinction. The contest came down to Florida. After vote counts, recounts, and 2 U.S. Supreme Court decisions, George Bush finally emerged the winner in Florida. But because of the state's voting procedures, people are still arguing about the outcome. There was the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County, the infamous hanging pregnant and dimpled chads, and in disproportionately black voting areas, Ms. Brazile has said, people faced dogs, guns, and were required to have 3 forms of ID. Al Gore won the popular vote, Ms. Brazile said after the election. I did my job. I did get the vote out. Unfortunately, I didn't get to count the vote. When Ms. Brazile took over the Gore campaign, she reduced the staff by half and slashed salaries, including her own. She supervised the move to Nashville and stepped up the attack on challenger Bill Bradley. Campaign and Elections magazine named Ms. Brazile Campaign Manager of the Year. Mirabella magazine also has recognized her as one of the 25 smartest women in America. After the election, Ms. Brazile said she had one regret. She wished she had focused more on Tennessee, Al Gore's home state. If he had won Tennessee, Gore and perhaps Ms. Brazile would be in the White House today. Ms. Brazile was born 41 years ago in New Orleans, one of 9 children, but grew up in Kenner, a New Orleans suburb. She actually began her political career at the age of 9, when she and several friends she recruited went door to door campaigning for a city council candidate who promised to build them a playground. The candidate won, and Donna and her friends got their playground. In 1984, after graduating from Louisiana State University with a degree in industrial psychology, she went to work for the Reverend Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign, serving as a Southern field director. It was an experience she has never forgotten. I will go to my grave remembering that run in 1984, she says. It was not a campaign, it was a movement. Jesse Jackson gave me my soul for this. She has since worked in the presidential campaigns of Richard Gephardt, Michael Dukakis, Bill Clinton, and of course, Al Gore. Ms. Brazile is known for her piercing commentary, words that have sometimes come back to haunt her. In 1988, she challenged then-President George Bush's marital fidelity, for which she was fired from the Dukakis campaign. And last year, she accused Republicans of tokenism regarding race relations, saying the party brings out Colin Powell and J.C. Watts because, quote, they have no program, no policy. They have no love and no joy. They'd rather take pictures with black children than feed them. Since leaving the campaign, Ms. Brazile has returned to teaching. She is now an adjunct professor at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and she is considering a race for a D.C. City Council seat. Last year, when she took over the Gore campaign, a reporter asked her if she felt nervous. I'm a woman, 40 years old, whose birth certificate says Negro, she said. With all that lying on top of me, nothing scares me. My whole life's been a victory. And indeed it has. Please join me in welcoming Donna Brazile to the National Press Club.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. I will not say anything piercing today, but if I do, God help me. Thank you also, Darcy, and this distinguished table for inviting me to the National Press Club. It's so good to see so many of my friends out here, so many of my colleagues from the Gore-Lieberman campaign, friends from the Civil Rights Movement, and of course my great neighbors and friends from the District of Columbia. Although this is my first time speaking here, I've participated in many events over the years, and I'm delighted to be back home here in our nation's capital. Last year, following the Supreme Court intervention in the 2000 presidential campaign, I called my good friend and George Bush chief strategist Karl Rove to wish him well. I offered to send Karl a roadmap of Washington, D.C., and recommended that the president sit down early with Mayor Tony Williams and members of the Black Caucus. He listened, and I appreciate Karl's tenacity and commitment to making things happen. We also talked about one of my favorite subjects, cooking. When I'm not running around stirring the pots and working up ways to win a campaign, I enjoy stirring up my favorite New Orleans-style gumbo. Karl and I met at a restaurant in New Hampshire about a year ago, and like most political operatives who meet for the first time, we made a bet on the outcome of the 2000 presidential election. We bet that the winner, of course, would cook his or her favorite dish. The loser would probably pick up the tab. Well, after the results of the election in November, we didn't get a chance to sit down and have our delicious meal. Karl did remind me, however, that it was time to go back to cooking. I haven't planned the menu, but if I do get a chance to stir up some Louisiana-style Creole red beans and rice with andouille sausage, I'll invite Karl over pretty soon to have some of his Texas-style chili. There is some doubt, my friends, however. We have to agree to who will fry the chicken. For now, Karl Rove has been busy managing President Bush's first 100 days in office, and I spent the time away up in Cambridge at the Institute of Politics. In addition to spending time hosting my weekly study group on presidential politics, I took time out to heal and to reflect on the election and to monitor federal and state efforts to reform our election system. As you can imagine, this was a very important issue for me. When you get this close to winning, not losing, but this close to winning, clearly you want to go back and take a look at all of the steps you made and retrace your steps and figure out what you can do to make the system better for all Americans. After Florida, we all need to ask ourselves, where do we go from here? Sadly, today I'm here to report that election reform and efforts to reform our voting system has all but stalled. Too many state governments have stopped reviewing the condition of their voting equipment, as well as their voting procedures. According to the National Association of State Legislators, over 1,500 bills have been introduced in all 50 states since last November. But to date, only one governor, one Southern governor, has signed legislation to update his voting systems. That's Governor Roy Barnes of Georgia. Last week, Governor Jane Hall of Arizona removed and vetoed money to update their voting equipment. Incidentally, the voting equipment, of course, that's in poor and minority communities in Arizona. She vetoed that bill. And in another state, Maryland, the state legislature has passed a bill that will require the State Board of Election to select and certify a new voting system for that state to be used in all counties in time for their next election. Yet the governor, as of today, I believe, has yet to sign that into law. So meanwhile, time is running out in most states. 25 states have adjourned for the year. Some will soon come back with special sessions to devote to redistricting, but by and large, the issue is all but dead. But even if all of the states acted today and they began to enact serious election reform, it still will not be enough. To make true election reform a reality, the Congress of the United States must act to provide national resources, and the Bush administration needs to provide leadership in this area. I must admit that last week when I had an opportunity to tune into the congressional hearings held on the House side, the first hearing, and again, last week, the House held its first hearing, the Senate has held 2 hearings, I believe another is on the way. None other than Florida Secretary of State Katherine Harris, and I will not grow up to be like her. She told members of Congress that election reform is not a Florida imperative. I agree with her. Talk about politics making strange bedfellows. I agree. Katherine Harris has now become a reformer. But what has happened in Florida? They're stalled. The House has passed one version of the bill, the Senate has passed another version, and meanwhile the House is proposing that the counties take out a loan to pay for their systems. The Senate has approved $25 million. Where's Jeb Bush? Where's his leadership? Where's his brother? Unless the Republican-controlled Congress and the Bush administration put this important item back on track, the 2002 midterm elections will produce one of the lowest off-season turnouts in the history of this country. People's dissatisfaction with their democracy will only grow, and many Americans, including this one, will remain angry and upset. While impassioned about what happened in Florida, I am also reminded of Scripture. See, I told you Jesse will always be with me. I learned a lot from him, and I wish him well. But in the book of Ephesians, there's a wonderful scripture that reminds us that in our anger, we should not sin. And I'm going to read the other passage. I quote, "Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry." When the sun went down on election day, Americans from all walks of life and all political persuasions were angry about how the election was conducted. They were angry about legally cast votes not counted, about law-abiding citizens being turned away, and by those who were selectively purged from the voter registration database and not being placed on the database from the local motor registration office. Before the sun goes down in this past election, before it becomes an interesting chapter in our history, it is the responsibility of our elected leaders, the Congress, the Bush administration, and of course citizens groups like the League of Women Voters and many others that are out there spearheading this drive to turn the anger from the November election into positive energy to revive American democracy and give every citizen a voice at the political table. The kind of relief they seek is just the kind of relief that George Bush is talking about, but he's talking on the wrong issue. We're looking for good old-fashioned voting relief and political leaders with backbone who believe in the principle that every vote should count. As a student of American democracy and a second-generation eligible voter and a former campaign manager, I'm eager to roll up my sleeves once again and try to get out the next vote in time for our next election, which is about 552 days away. Some of us keep calendars. I also have the precise time when we can remove some other folks from office as well. I have to admit that when I started the Gore campaign in early 1999, I thought 2000 was going to be my last campaign. I'm sure the national press would have enjoyed that as well. Luckily, I had one of the best seats for this election, not just a seat at the table, but a glass ceiling broken for women and minorities in American politics. After a After a lifetime of grassroots organizing and door-to-door campaigning and working to register tens of thousands of people to vote and millions more to turn out, I felt that this was the end of my journey in American politics. I was ready to get a job. And as some of my friends say, get a life. But after the way the election ended and the lack of attention election reform has received by politicians and pundits alike, I can't move on now. You know, the president, when he went to Florida, said it's time for us to move on. Well, I can't move on. I don't know about you. And Mr. President, how can you move on? How can anyone move on after hearing so many angry voices and meeting so many people with bitterness felt in their spirits? A bitterness not toward one person or party, but toward the very heart of our democracy, our electoral process itself. Florida showed me that it's no time to grow weary. Instead, this election showed us that despite all we have done to widen democracy's embrace, we have taken too much for granted. We assumed that everyone had equal and fair access to the polls, that every neighborhood was equipped with machines that could accurately count ballots, that every American knew how to exercise their right to vote. We assumed too much. Over the years of organizing marches and countless voter registration campaigns, I'll never forget a lesson that Martin Luther King put so well. He said that voting was more than a badge of citizenship and dignity. It is the most effective tool for change. And after this past election, it's time that we change the way we cast our ballots in America. Let me conclude by giving you a little bit of what I like to call common sense election reform. You see, I believe that there's no place in our democracy for chads. Not pregnant chads, not dimpled chads, not hanging chads. There's no place in our democracy for long lines. There's no place in our democracy for broken machines or untrained poll workers. There's no place in our democracy for police interference. There's no place in our democracy from purging legal voters from the rolls prior to election, like they just did in North Carolina, 17%. 900,000 people that the League of Women Voters and the NAACP and others will now have to go and find and try to get back on the rolls in time to vote in 2002, a very important election in North Carolina. The Senate hangs in the balance. But there's no place in our democracy for badgering a citizen, as my own sister was badgered in Florida. Just so happened that a couple of us did move out of Louisiana. She moved to Florida, I moved to Washington. She went to vote. They asked her, not for one, not for two, but 3 forms of ID. Luckily, she's a Brazile, and you know what she did. She got a chance to vote, and she also helped others to vote, but she had to, in the words of my other sister, act a little crazy. Now, judging from me, you know what that means. So what are the common sense election reform measures that we can undertake to put citizens back in control of the voting booth? The National Association of Secretaries of States deserve credit for coming up with a list of items to recommend to Congress and the states. They have really taken the lead, many of the secretaries of states across the country, in trying to find solutions. That's how Georgia got the ball rolling. It was the Secretary of State, Ms. Cox, who got it rolling. And in many other states, the Secretary of State. That's why Katherine Harris is now a reformer. But let me give you what I like to call the 10 commandments of election reform, the easy things that we can do. I want to use it in the language that they speak sometime on Capitol Hill, commandments. Let me start with number 1. States with language minorities should adopt multilingual ballot instructions. It's a shame that people who speak Spanish and Creole and French and Chinese, Mandarin, are unable to go and cast their ballots because there are no ballots that they can understand. And in many states, they are turned away. That's an easy idea that should be implemented without a lot of fanfare and don't cost a lot of money. Just require a translator and the right printer. States should adopt no-excuse absentee voting to allow working families, as well as Americans with disabilities, veterans, seniors, and students, the opportunity to vote. There's no reason why we shouldn't have a no-excuse policy. Right now, you have to fill out a long laundry list in some states, get a witness, sometimes 2 witnesses, before you can get an absentee ballot. That is just wrong. States should ensure that every polling site complies with the standards set by the Americans with Disabilities Act. There are states now and cities that are changing their voting systems and not even looking at whether or not they are handicap accessible, whether or not people who are unable to read, who are blind, physically challenged, are unable to even cast their ballots. And we should make sure that all states comply, at least with those standards. States should allow citizens the right to register to vote online and verify their voter registration prior to Election Day. Virginia actually has a good system where you can actually go online, see if you register, and your county will get back in touch with you. Only 5 other states have systems like that in place. States should train Election Day workers as well as Election Day administrators and officials on voting technology as well as ballot instructions. A lot of people were turned away from Philadelphia to St. Louis last year because they just didn't know, and they didn't know what to tell people. They got there, the election workers were tired, they didn't know what to say, and many people were turned away. States should also adopt uniform polling hours to allow voters more time to get to voting precinct at a polling site on time. Most of these states have this tight 10 to 12-hour window. I understand it's difficult to find Election Day workers. Those of us who are campaign operatives got to find the same type of workers on Election Day, so you have to go out there and recruit people early. You got to pay them something so they can, get lunch and park and do all of the other things. But we really should expand those voting hours like New York from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. to allow people the opportunity to vote. People work. They have kids, they got to get them off to school, then they got to pick them up, and then they have to decide if they have time in their busy day to vote. We should make it a little bit more family friendly. Of course, this is one that's near to my heart, and so perhaps it'll get the butterflies out of my stomach if we ban all butterfly ballots and design new uniform ballots that are easy to read and understand. Sample ballots should be published online. Copies should be made available to local newspapers. Currently, only 3 states, western states, California, Washington, and Oregon, actually produce sample ballots, send them out to voters prior to Election Day. They don't put any mystery in there. We should find ways to encourage more states to do that. Of course, nonpartisan organizations, civic associations should go back to the old method. Lauren Skiat is here, and he understands this, of holding teach-ins and Election Day forums to educate voters prior to turnout day. States should also adopt legislation to allow each citizen the right to a provisional ballot. I know some people don't like this idea that when people turn up and say, I did register, I voted during the primary, and for whatever reason they cannot find their name, they're turned away. Give them a provisional ballot or a replacement ballot. I mean, that is the heart of our democracy, to allow people to participate in the political system. But these days, when they purge people from the voter rolls, unless the old system is kept in place, the old database, then those names are lost forever, and those people deserve to have a provisional ballot when they go to the polls next year. Of course, I'm going to say something controversial. It wouldn't be me if I didn't, so here I go. States should restore ex-felons' right to vote and urge them to volunteer on Election Day. Look, there's no reason why men and women who served their time and made their amends to society back in the community shouldn't have the right to vote. Back during the Depression, I'm reading this book, when people went to apply for unemployment benefits, they had their voting rights taken away from them. That's wrong. We should try to find ways to increase the number of people who are active in the political process and not take away rights. And finally, this is one of my important reforms. States should adopt programs to train young people to serve as poll workers by giving them high school community service credit to register other young Americans to vote. Currently, only 3 states, California, Colorado, and North Dakota, allow states. Doug Bailey, the founder of Hotline, has this program called Youth at the Booth. We should give young people an opportunity to be election day workers, train them, give them a stake in our political process. Why not? Let them register. Let them get involved. Make it fun for them, and of course give them some community credit. This is the most active generation in terms of community service. Well, let's add this to the activities that they can sign up for and see how many young people we can get involved in the political process. Now more than ever, we need these reforms, not only because no one wants to see another Florida happen where they live, but also because this year we are redrawing the political map to make our nation more representative. Some states will lose seats, some states will gain. But what will ordinary citizens gain? With campaign finance reform on the verge of becoming law, they have much to gain electing leaders in the systems where big money has less influence. But campaign finance reform means nothing without electoral reform. There are 2 sides of the same coin, and they must go hand in hand. 40 years ago this week, a small group of young people gathered here in Washington, D.C. These 13 young men and women boarded 2 buses, a Greyhound and a Trailway, here in the nation's capital for a trip down south. It was the first Freedom Ride, a trip to bring America closer to its ideals of equality and justice. 13 days and 1,500 miles stood between them and their final stop in my home city, New Orleans. Along the way, the Freedom Riders were beaten, bombed, and jailed, but they never faltered in their journey. They continued to fight for equality, and later that summer began a massive voter registration effort in places where people didn't even know they could, in theory, vote. We've come a long way since then. One of those Freedom Riders now sits in the House of Representatives. African Americans, Hispanics, women, gays and lesbians, the physically challenged, and people of all backgrounds sit in jobs, live in homes, and hold positions that would have been unthinkable 4 decades ago. To honor their legacy, to live up to the expectations of the generation of Americans who constantly pushed us to realize America's full promise as a democracy, we must take up this fight for election reform. All Americans, no matter their political affiliation, must join us in repairing the machine of democracy, because it is the machine at the heart of our nation. Thank you so much, and I look forward. Thank you. I understand that you have a couple of softball questions. How did I keep my tan intact, being on the road so long? Have I gained as much weight as someone I used to work for? And whether or not this is really gray hair. Now, you can, those are good questions, and I look forward to answering them.
Well, as the first softball question, tell us how in the world Al Gore lost Tennessee. He and his father represented the state for nearly a half a century. There's a couple questions about Gore and Tennessee, if you'd like to answer that.
Yes, sir. I lived in Tennessee. I enjoyed Tennessee. If any Tennesseans are watching today or listening, I still love Tennessee, and I have my boots to show it. It was a difficult state. The demographics of that state changed. The Bush campaign, strategically, I believe, made the right decision because they wanted a solid South. They invested a lot of resources in that state, not only money on TV, mail, phone calls. The president, I can say President Bush, made a couple of stops in the state. It didn't take long for me to come up with it. His father was Bush as well, so I just reread the script, and it's still President Bush. We lost it, I think, because of cultural differences that have taken place in that state. Guns played a large role in that state, and we could not get enough, as I call it, mashed potatoes to help with the gravy that we were pouring out on Election Day. So we lost Tennessee, we lost Arkansas, we also lost Louisiana, and that's why I'm going home this afternoon to check on my family and also to tell them that they can restore Louisiana's, soul by re-electing Mary Landrieu next year. Don't mess with Mary. That's my message.
Did the Gore campaign put enough resources into those states, or did you sort of take them for granted? Talking about Tennessee, Georgia, Louisiana, Arkansas? In June of 2000, the political playing field, the goal, the magic number is 270. The political playing field was about 25 battleground states. Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Georgia, as well as Florida, were all considered battleground states at that point. We put resources in, limited resources in some states, more resources in other states. We failed at that time to put money in Tennessee in terms of fighting the Republicans head on, and I think that contributed to our loss. But then again, the vice president is there, the former vice president is there now teaching at Fisk in Middle Tennessee State, and he may know a little bit more about why he lost Tennessee. But I believe that we lost it because the Bush campaign, our opponents put more resources, and demographically that state has become very conservative over the last 6 years. 2 senators, 2 Republican senators, 1 Republican governor, and of course only 3 Democratic lawmakers. What's your opinion about going to sort of like a 3-day voting, weekend voting, so to give enough people to vote, and probably voting on the internet? Here's one question that says, should we adopt computer and/or ATM voting?
Well, I'm for making voting as accessible as possible so as many people can participate. I believe internet voting is going to be the wave of the future. Arizona experimented with it last year during the primary. They had a 41% turnout. There was some glitches in it, mainly from those who were Mac users that were not able to hook into the system. There's a little problem with security. I think once we fix some of the problems with internet voting, that will be a wave for the future. I believe California, once again, and some other states are taking a look at internet voting. There are 2 states now looking at that. I am for early voting. It makes a difference in trying to get people out. You know, I know some of you who are on the other side, the 4th estate, and some of you who are organizers understand what I'm talking about. I mean, we spend a lot of money trying to encourage people to turn out and vote. If we gave them more of a window, a 2-week window, when they had time on weekends or time during the afternoons to go to the county courthouse or go to the post office to put in their form. We should make voting as easy and as accessible as possible. I don't know why voting is so complicated, why the rules vary from state to state. In some states there's 14 days before. 7 states now allow you to do early voting, but the rules are so complicated. Absentee ballots, as I mentioned in my speech, some states require 2 or 3 witnesses in order for you to cast your ballot. So I believe that voting should be easy, should be accessible, and I also believe it should be fun.
Would you put any restrictions on TV reporting? You know, there's been comments that early projections may have influenced the outcome of the election. And do you think that the media can be blamed for what happened?
Well, I think it's time for me to ask for reparations. I was feeling very good after the first, after the networks called Florida for Al Gore, and I'm telling you, I felt so good. I hadn't slept in 2-3 days, and I was ready to complete this journey. And a couple hours later, when the networks pulled it back, I'm telling you, that 2 hours, I should get a little compensation from the networks. But barring the First Amendment, and I understand how the networks feel about this and how they like to project and be the first to declare the winner and all the excitement, the hoopla, and going behind the scene and seeing the balloons drop on time. I would hold back. Given what happened this year, some of those projections are wrong. I do believe that the projections were right in the first place at 7 o'clock when they called it for Gore. I do. Can't lie to you. 3%, we had a 3% lead, and I do believe at the end of the day that more Americans intended to go and vote for Al Gore in Florida than our opponent, George Bush. That's my belief. You don't have to agree with it.
You talked a little bit about your emotional experience that night, but this question would like to know what was it emotionally like for Vice President Gore? What were the various stages he went through during that evening, and how does one get over that?
Well, I'm sure that the Vice President, Mrs. Gore, and Senator Lieberman and Mrs. Lieberman are all still recovering. from that experience. It was an emotional roller coaster. By 9 o'clock, things had changed. You know, when at 7 o'clock, I'll never forget, Pennsylvania came in, Michigan came in, Florida came in. You know, all bells were ringing on our side. By 9:30, 10 o'clock, it was a little downhill from there. We all went upstairs and gathered. We watched the returns for the next 2.5 hours, and then, of course, when it seemed bleak, close to midnight, the vice president at that time decided that he wanted to go down and talk to Mrs. Gore. Senator Lieberman went to talk to his wife. They wanted to break the news to the family. At that point, we were 50,000 votes behind George Bush. And between midnight and 1 o'clock, the votes kept going down. And right as we were driving to the War Memorial, close to, you know, 1:30 at night, that's when we got a call from Michael Hooley and through Michael Feldman that we were down below 2,000, and that kicks in the automatic. Florida is one of those states with automatic recount, and that's when the vice president had to call Governor Bush again and make that famous statement that, I'm not going to repeat that. I was there, though.
Another suggestion here, perhaps, about election reform. It says, with all the diverse languages in the United States, would you recommend that ballots be printed in a variety of different languages so each citizen would be able to vote?
Not only do I believe it should be, printed in all languages, available. If you know 5% of your population is Hispanic, you know, put aside 5% of your ballots, or however many, in Spanish. If you know that you have a Creole population, as they knew in Miami, put aside some ballots. Now, that's not requesting any state to spend a lot of money. It's just put aside some ballots. And also, I mentioned the butterfly ballot. D.C. is about to go to an optical scan system. I'm concerned about that because that ballot may be confusing. This is one of those systems that allow you to, you know, go from one line to the next line. And we just learned in Chicago and some other places they had problems, you know, people had problems, you know, getting the lines right. And some people walked in there and didn't use a number 2 pencil and their votes were kicked out. They had more discarded ballots in Florida and Cook County alone. So I believe that ballots should be easy to read. They should be simple. The name should be as bold and as pretty as you can possibly. Hopefully you'll put Democrat first because D come before R. And then take it from there. You know, forget all of the alphabetical order, Democrat, Gore, Republican, Bush, and take it from there. And then, of course, allow voters to you know, cast their ballots, and, of course, make sure every vote is counted.
This questioner worries that instead of spurring reform, the Florida election might actually bog the political parties down. He wonders if the parties will remain stuck debating what happened in Florida and what happened around the country, rather instead of moving on to what needs to happen in the future.
Well, I do believe Florida legislature will recess for the year in 2 days. So hopefully Jeb Bush and Katherine Harris are sitting down right now somewhere with their Republican-controlled friends, and I'm not being partisan, but they control the legislature down there, and work out some compromise so that at least we can restore confidence in Florida. Georgia was the first state, a Democratic governor, Roy Barnes. Paris Glendening has 2 bills before him. So I think it's important that we get something done in Florida in time for the next election so that the rest of the country can say, well, if they can do it in Florida, we can do it in California.
And this questioner notes that Walter Mondale, another former vice president and presidential candidate, said in this room after the 1984 campaign that he had wanted to run for president in the worst way, and he did. Do you feel that same way about the Gore campaign?
He must have an independent in the room. I feel that Al Gore and the Gore campaign ran a very good campaign. I know some people disagree. Let me tell you, when I started working for Al Gore was 20 points behind in the polls. I started early in 1999, 20 points behind. We overcame that deficit. They outraised us in the primary. George W. Bush had $100 million to spend. We stayed within the legal limits of $33 million. I think in the summer months, we focused on some of the issues that were important. I believe the Bush campaign was able early on to run as a moderate, as a centrist campaign. They had a better message in terms of, reaching out to suburban independent voters. But overall, I think we ran the kind of campaign that helped us garner over 50 million votes, 500,000 more than our opponent. And again, George W. Bush sits in the White House today, but I believe that Al Gore ran an effective campaign. And people also ask, in case this one's going to come up, let me just address this one. Could we have used Bill Clinton more? We used Bill Clinton very effectively to help us not only raise money, but also solidify our base and get out a tremendous turnout on Election Day.
Well, that was pretty perceptive, because that was the next question. You've been looking over my shoulder.
Yes, sir, I have.
So there are a number of questions here that say, so if you had to do it over again, what would you change? What were the main lessons learned from the 2000 campaign? Looking back, what was the single biggest mistake of the Gore campaign?
Okay, if I had to do it all over again, I would have forced the DNC. At the time, I did not force the DNC, I requested. I'm a DNC member, so all I could do was to request. I would have forced the DNC to put more money in voter education. We had a lot of first-time, inexperienced voters, and that left a mark on me. That's important, and I'm going to remind the Democratic Party, I'm going to remind the DCCC, and everyone else I can remind, voter education is just as important as turnout. We've got to make sure that we do that. So if I had to do it all over again, I would have done that. Now, in terms of Tennessee, clearly I would have started the campaign, but I'm not the candidate, but I would have started the campaign in Tennessee and not in Washington, D.C. We spent a lot of money, a lot of time in Washington, D.C., twirling our fingers, talking to, people inside the Beltway, and that we spent a lot of resources that we could have used in some of those other key states. So that's the second thing I would have done. The third thing is that I have no regrets. I mean, I had not only did I have one of the best seats in the House, I happened to work for the Vice President of the United States of America. I had an opportunity to sit on Air Force Two practically every day of my life. And I had a wonderful time, not just organizing, but training. But when I look back, we had a black state director in Florida, a female state director in Illinois, a Hispanic state director in Colorado. And so we made tremendous gains in opening up the political doors to other political operatives to get involved in the political process. And I like to think that that was made possible by having a candidate like Al Gore, but also having people around the table who believed in inclusion and allowing others to participate in the political process.
This questioner wonders if it might not have been better for the country if Gore had conceded after the first machine recount in Florida instead of continuing to challenge the election for 36 days.
There was no way that Al Gore would have conceded, although there was tremendous amount of pressure from some allies on the Democratic side and others to concede, what's the end game. Al Gore, the principle was every vote cast should be counted. That's a principle. That's not a campaign slogan. And because that principle, he felt very strongly about that principle, we stayed and we fought.
Here are a couple of questions that would like you to tell them about Al Gore's future political plans. Say, what are his plans, and does Al Gore have a political future, or is he going to be forever branded a loser?
Well, Al Gore has a future. Joe Lieberman has a future. I believe I have a future. Thank you. I don't know what Al Gore intends to do. I haven't emailed or talked to him in a while. I wanted to spend some time this spring trying to get in touch with my own family and friends and get off the political treadmill, so to speak. If Al Gore decides to run in 2004, he will have a leg up in a race. He will have great organizational strength out there. He will have name recognition. He will have a fundraising base to start from, and of course he'll have many of the same players who helped him in this past year election willing to go back and get back on the playing field and help him win the election. That's if Al Gore chooses to do that. I believe Al Gore is making the right decision now and sitting back, relaxing, taking it easy, whatever he may be doing out of his home or on all of the campuses that he's been traveling to. But he's doing the right thing right now to allow this administration to accumulate a record and then come out there sometime this fall and speak out on some of the issues of the day.
As we noted earlier, that the Vice President won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College vote, and that caused a number of people to say, hey, we ought to change that Electoral College. It doesn't work. What do you think about that?
You know, 46 out of 50 elections, Electoral College has a 92% rating. It allows small states and small jurisdictions like the District of Columbia to have a say in the process. I wouldn't change it. I know there are some lawmakers on Capitol Hill that are looking at electoral reform in that sense, changing the Electoral College. 2 states, North Carolina, I forget the other one, is trying to revise their system to allow electors to be chosen by a congressional district similar to Maine and Nebraska. But I wouldn't change it. I would leave it as 46 out of 50. We've had 4 close elections, 4 minority presidents. Now George Bush is a minority, but I think it's worked so far, and hopefully it'll work in 2004 when Gore come back and trounce George Bush.
That's a prophecy. In your belief, do you believe now that in the first few months in office that George Bush is sincere in his attempts to reach out to African Americans? And a related question. What do you think about George Bush's cabinet? Do you think that he still engages in tokenism in terms of his diversity, or do you think it sort of does represent America?
Well, let me just say that George Bush took a chapter out of Bill Clinton's book, and his cabinet looks like America. Now, that being said, that's a nice one, isn't it? I just said it real nice, huh? Right. In terms of, what was the second part of that question?
Second part of the question. Is he sincere in his attempts to reach out to African Americans?
Look, I don't know the man's heart. He referred to his heart a lot last time during the election, and I don't know the man's heart, but I hope he is sincere in reaching out to all Americans who desire to have a president who support them, who will represent them, and who will fight for them. And so that's the best way to answer that. I have nothing personally against George Bush and his administration. My thing is, if you don't like somebody, then take them out in 4 years when they're up for re-election. And until that time, just slowly criticize the bad things, praise some of the good things, and then just focus on the goal. And that's it. I'm not really interested in critiquing his 100 days. By the way, I don't have a long list of accomplishments from his first 100 days as well. I've been concerned about the drinking water. That's why I'm drinking club soda. I'm still concerned. As someone who drank the Mississippi River water for the first 18 years of my life, I am very concerned. That water did me justice. It gave me my bones and my spirit, but I'm afraid to touch this other stuff until George Bush clarifies how he attempts to clean the environment.
A good cabinet, but poor water. This questioner notes that a Battleground 2002 poll this week found that African Americans are more motivated to vote next year than white voters in general, and white fundamentalist Christians in particular. Do you agree with that finding?
Well, if they say it is so, I hope it is. I hope every American next year go out to the polls, 552 days after you get that Christmas outfit and do all those other great things this year, then join me in helping the Democrats on Capitol Hill go back out in the trenches and get out the vote.
In that spirit, this question wants to know if you have any ideas how to get the millions of citizens who do not participate to come out and vote next time. He notes that Ralph Nader sought to reach these Americans and these voters and seemed to have some success, as you were well aware of in Florida.
First of all, there's a myth out there that Ralph Nader did anything to spur turnout. He created a lot of noise, had a lot of confusion, but he didn't do a thing to get turnout. We won the youth vote. We won the green vote. We won the pro-choice vote. We won the pro-civil rights vote, the pro-affirmative action vote, the pro-working family vote. And let me just tell you, so I have nothing against third parties and third-party interests, but I must say this. We must work overtime in order to urge these young people to find their seat and their voice at the political table. I spent a lot of time up there in Massachusetts trying to convince young people that their voice matters, that their vote will count, and that they should come in. I got in at an early age. You mentioned 9 years old. This was my 7th presidential campaign. Before I turned 18, I was Carter Mondale precinct coordinator in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. I organized a rally in the French Quarter before I was 18, and that was important to me to get out there and get involved early in the process. And of course, I was motivated and inspired by the civil rights movement in this country. So I hope young people find their voice at the table, and we need to give them the torch. Whether or not they're ready to accept it, it's their turn. It's their turn to take their place at the table.
I mean, you said in your speech that you learned a lot from the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Tell us just exactly what it was that you did learn from him.
What did I learn from him?
What did you learn from him?
I learned that suffering breeds character, and character breeds faith, and in the end, faith will not disappoint you. That was Reverend's favorite. I learned that justice rolled down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. I learned that you can go anywhere in this country, and I have. I mentioned to Frank a moment ago, I've been to 46 states. I've worked on 7 presidential campaigns, 55 congressional campaigns, 18 mayoral campaigns. I learned that my skin color, my gender, is no excuse for me not, to get involved in the political process. Reverend Jackson taught me that. Reverend Jackson also gave people like me and Mignon Moore. We happen to be 2 black women. I mentioned Mignon. She's currently the executive director of the DNC. But can you imagine in the year 2000, the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States had 2 African-American women who worked for Jesse Jackson, who served as their chief political operatives. That, only in America can that happen. And I thank Reverend Jackson for that opportunity and many other opportunities that he's given to African-Americans and others all across this country to inspire them to run for public office, to register millions of people to vote. And people talk a good game about Reverend Jackson, but you know what? Reverend Jackson every morning called me at 6:30, and he would say, "Donna, this is your brother." And I said, "Oh, man." And he said, "What is it I must do?" And that's Reverend Jackson. He heard the call. He got the call early in life, and he served us for over 40 years. And I wish him well, and I know he's going through a tremendous, challenge right now in his personal life, his private life, but his public life is one that I will always support. And his crusade for equal justice and opportunity for all is one that I will always support as well.
This questioner starts out with Miss Brazile. While you were on the campaign trail, you always seemed so much in control. What was really going on behind the scenes? Inquiring minds would like to know.
I like that question.
I knew you would.
Yeah, this is one I like. Well, I believe that to whom much is given, much is required. And that's from the book of Luke. I'm one of those practicing Catholics. It was a tremendous opportunity to not only be campaign manager, but also to have so many young people, so many staff looking up to you. And for the first time in my life, I realized I had to grow up. I'm like, oh, I am responsible for all of these people. I have to make sure they get their paycheck, their health insurance. And for me, it was a tremendous opportunity. And the Vice President backed me up 100% in many of the tough decisions I had to make. And I enjoyed being able to be on that bus, that campaign bus, for the closest presidential election in 112 years. So I was in control because I believe that there's a higher force in my life that always take care of what they call children and you know what else.
There's a number of questions here that people want to know about your personal political career. Why the D.C. City Council? Will you run for the D.C. Council? Here's one. You have a lot of common sense ideas. When will you run for office? Let us know what you're up to.
I like that one, too.
I knew that.
I decided when I got back home in December and after the last campaign that I wanted to spend some time thinking about my own future. I've spent a lot of time thinking about other people's future, and this was the first New Year's of my life since 1969 where I didn't have a candidate or a campaign to go to, so I had no excuse not to spend my Christmas holidays not focusing on my own life and what I would do once I grew up. And so I'm thinking about getting a real job. not another campaign. That's very difficult for me because I enjoy politics so well. And I love this city. This city has been my political birthplace. It's given me tremendous opportunities. I enjoy working for Eleanor Holmes Norton. I enjoy doing grassroots organizing. And I really do believe that this is one of the best cities, not just in this country, but on this planet. And of course, it's the most powerful city in the world, and it should have people to represent you on the city council that care about the quality of your schools, the quality of your air, and your quality of your drinking water, as well as many other decent, affordable housing. I can go on, but I'm thinking about it, and I hope and I'll pray that I'll make some decisions sometime in the fall.
And before I ask the last question, I'd like to do a little bit of business up here. First of all, I'd like to present you with the certificate of appreciation for your appearance here today at the Press Club.
Thank you.
And secondly, I'd like to present you with the National Press Club coffee mug or tea mug or whatever else.
Sir. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Now, for the last question, and I know this one comes from a very perceptive member of the head table, and it says, again, Miss Brazile, you appear more relaxed and optimistic. What's your secret?
I'll confess I wrote that myself. And look, you know, journalists are not accustomed to being kind and nice, so I wanted to make sure I had one that I could answer. And I just had one of the greatest opportunities in my life to participate and be a fellow at the Institute of Politics up at Harvard. For a little black kid to grow up and to reach most of her dreams by the age of 40 of working on a presidential campaign and finally running a presidential campaign, as well as traveling all over this country. And for 20 years I've done so, and I've returned from every journey, sometimes wounded, but always more optimistic about America and all of her opportunities and challenges. So I appear relaxed because I know that despite the problems and despite the fact that nothing is being done, I do believe that in this system of democracy that something will happen before the next election. So thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you all for coming. I hope today that you learned a little bit more about election reform, but I really hope that you go out there and talk about it, talk it up so that members of Congress and the Bush administration will hear your voice and they will lift their voices and sing before the next election. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. I'd like to thank all of you coming today. I'd also like to thank National Press Club staff members Melinda Cook, Pat Nelson, Joanne Booz, Melanie Abdel-Dermot, and Howard Rothman for organizing today's luncheon. And also thanks to the NPC Library for their research. Thank you. We are adjourned. Nothing scares me. My whole life's been a victory. And indeed it has. Please join me in welcoming Donna Brazile to the National Press Club.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. I will not say anything piercing today, but if I do, God help me. Thank you also, Darcy, and this distinguished table for inviting me to the National Press Club. It's so good to see so many of my friends out here, so many of my colleagues from the Gore-Lieberman campaign, friends from the Civil Rights Movement, and of course my great neighbors and friends from the District of Columbia. Although this is my first time speaking here, I've participated in many events over the years, and I'm delighted to be back home here in our nation's capital. Last year, following the Supreme Court intervention in the 2000 presidential campaign, I called my good friend and George Bush chief strategist Karl Rove to wish him well. I offered to send Karl a roadmap of Washington, D.C., and recommended that the president sit down early with Mayor Tony Williams and members of the Black Caucus. He listened, and I appreciate Karl's tenacity and commitment to making things happen. We also talked about one of my favorite subjects, cooking. When I'm not running around stirring the pots and working up ways to win a campaign, I enjoy stirring up my favorite New Orleans-style gumbo. Carl and I met at a restaurant in New Hampshire about a year ago, and like most political operatives who meet for the first time, we made a bet on the outcome of the 2000 presidential election. We bet that the winner, of course, would cook his or her favorite dish. The loser would probably pick up the tab. Well, after the results of the election in November, we didn't get a chance to sit down and have our delicious meal. Carl did remind me, however, that it was time to go back to cooking. I haven't planned the menu, but if I do get a chance to stir up some Louisiana-style Creole red beans and rice with andouille sausage, I'll invite Carl over pretty soon to have some of his Texas-style chili. There is some doubt, my friends, however. We have to agree to who will fry the chicken. For now, Karl Rove has been busy managing President Bush's first 100 days in office, and I spent the time away up in Cambridge at the Institute of Politics. In addition to spending time hosting my weekly study group on presidential politics, I took time out to heal and to reflect on the election and to monitor federal and state efforts to reform our election system. As you can imagine, this was a very important issue for me. When you get this close to winning, not losing, but this close to winning, clearly you want to go back and take a look at all of the steps you made and retrace your steps and figure out what you can do to make the system better for all Americans. After Florida, we all need to ask ourselves, where do we go from here? Sadly, today I'm here to report that election reform and efforts to reform our voting system has all but stalled. Too many state governments have stopped reviewing the condition of their voting equipment, as well as their voting procedures. According to the National Association of State Legislators, over 1,500 bills have been introduced in all 50 states since last November. But to date, only one governor, one Southern governor, has signed legislation to update his voting systems. That's Governor Roy Barnes of Georgia. Last week, Governor Jane Hall of Arizona removed and vetoed money to update their voting equipment. Incidentally, the voting equipment, of course, that's in poor and minority communities in Arizona. She vetoed that bill. And in another state, Maryland, the state legislature has passed a bill that will require the State Board of Election to select and certify a new voting system for that state to be used in all counties in time for their next election. Yet the governor, as of today, I believe, has...
Mirabella magazine also has recognized her as one of the 25 smartest women in America. After the election, Ms. Brazile said she had one regret. She wished she had focused more on Tennessee, Al Gore's home state. If he had won Tennessee, Gore, and perhaps Ms. Brazile, would be in the White House today. Ms. Brazile was born 41 years ago in New Orleans, one of 9 children, but grew up in Kenner, a New Orleans suburb. She actually began her political career at the age of 9, when she and several friends she recruited went door to door campaigning for a city council candidate who promised to build them a playground. The candidate won, and Donna and her friends got their playground. In 1984, after graduating from Louisiana State University with a degree in industrial psychology, she went to work for the Reverend Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign, serving as a Southern field director. It was an experience she has never forgotten. I will go to my grave remembering that run in 1984, she says. It was not a campaign, it was a movement. Jesse Jackson gave me my soul for this. She has since worked in the presidential campaigns of Richard Gephardt, Michael Dukakis, Bill Clinton, and of course, Al Gore. Ms. Brazile is known for her piercing commentary, words that have sometimes come back to haunt her. In 1988, she challenged then-President George Bush's marital fidelity, for which she was fired from the Dukakis campaign. And last year, she accused Republicans of tokenism regarding race relations, saying the party brings out Colin Powell and J.C. Watts because, quote, they have no program, no policy. They have no love and no joy. They'd rather take pictures with black children than feed them. Since leaving the campaign, Ms. Brazile has returned to teaching She is now an adjunct professor at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and she is considering a race for a D.C. City Council seat. Last year, when she took over the Gore campaign, a reporter asked her if she felt nervous. "I'm a woman, 40 years old, whose birth certificate says Negro," she said. "With all that lying on top of me, Press Club." Frank Alcafer, chairman of the National Press Club Speaker Committee and a former president of the National Press Club. And skipping over our speaker for a moment, Darcy McConnell, Detroit News, and a member of the Speakers Committee who arranged today's luncheon. Thank you, Darcy. Julia Hudson, Chief of Staff for D.C. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. Catherine Skiba of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Larry Bivens, Gannett News Service, and a member of the National Press Club Board of Governors. And Will Lester, political writer for the Associated Press. Thank you. Few political operatives in the country have a better perspective on the need for election reform than our guest today, Donna Brazile. Ms. Brazile managed Al Gore's losing presidential campaign last year, the first African-American woman ever to manage a major presidential campaign. As we all know now, Vice President Gore won the nationwide popular vote, but lost the Electoral College vote to George W. Bush, becoming the first presidential candidate since Grover Cleveland lost to Benjamin Harrison in 1888 to achieve that dubious distinction. The contest came down to Florida. After vote counts, recounts, and 2 U.S. Supreme Court decisions, George Bush finally emerged the winner in Florida. But because of the state's voting procedures, people are still arguing about the outcome. There was the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County, the infamous hanging pregnant and dimpled chads, and in disproportionately black voting areas, Ms. Brazile has said, people faced dogs, guns, and were required to have 3 forms of ID. Al Gore won the popular vote, Ms. Brazile said after the election. "I did my job. I did get the vote out. Unfortunately, I didn't get to count the vote." When Ms. Brazile took over the Gore campaign, she reduced the staff by half and slashed salaries, including her own. She supervised the move to Nashville and stepped up the attack on challenger Bill Bradley. Campaign and Elections magazine named Ms. Brazile Campaign Manager of the Year. Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Richard Ryan, and I am Senior Washington Correspondent for the Detroit News and President of the National Press Club. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, and those of you watching on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio. The video archive of today's luncheon is provided by Connect Live and is available through the National Press Club website at press.org. National Press Club luncheons are also carried live by many sites on the World Wide Web. Press Club members may also access transcripts of our luncheons at our website. Non-members may purchase transcripts, audio and videotapes by calling 1-888-343-1940. Before introducing our head table, I would like to remind our members of some upcoming speakers. Tomorrow, on May 3rd, Vladimir Guzinski, chairman of the board of MediaMost, parent company of NTV, will speak on freedom of the press and the future of Russia. On Friday, May 4th, Richard Moe, president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, will be our guest. And on Friday, May 11th, William Gates Sr., co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, will speak at the National Press Club. If you have any questions for our speaker, please write them on the cards that are provided at your table and pass them up to me. But please make sure to write legibly, because I can't ask them if I can't read them. And I will ask as many as time will permit. I'd now like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. And please hold your applause until all head table guests are introduced. From your right and my left, Frank Davies of the Miami Herald. Paul De La Garza of the St. Petersburg Times. Rob Ritchie, Executive Director, Center for Voting and Democracy. Wayne Washington of the Boston Globe. Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins, President of the League of Women Voters of the United States. Rick Dunham, political correspondent for Business Week and Chairman of the Board of Governors of the National